All right, let's get started. Hello, my name is Dr. LeConté Dill. I'm an associate professor of African American and African Studies at Michigan State University, and a friend and colleague of Dr. Quinn. We'll talk more about that throughout the conversation. But we're here to celebrate Dr. Rachel Afi Quinn and her amazing book, Being La Dominicana. I'm gonna be your guide through this conversation. But first, a few logistics. As we all know, and we're well aware, being in Zoom space, there is Zoom captioning and transcripts are available. We can rock out for about an hour and a half, but I know sometimes, particularly being a Monday and often with a lot of talking and Zoom fatigue, some folks might have just allotted an hour, but we're here again to rock out for an hour and a half. But in honoring time, Rachel and I are gonna talk, we're gonna engage the text, we're gonna key, but then we'll start audience Q&A at about 6:15 Central Time. And then really engage with you all and your questions and your comments and your kudos. And then if we have more time, we'll go back to some questions that I have and conversations that Rachel and I have together. You can write your questions in the chat box at the bottom anytime throughout the conversation. We'll be monitoring them throughout, but again, starting QA at around 6:15 Central Time. And with that, Rachel is going to introduce herself and give some other shout outs.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Dill. Welcome everyone. It's really delightful and a little overwhelming to see so many people from the many chapters of my life and the journey with this book. I am excited to celebrate it and be thinking in conversation with LeConté this evening, so I appreciate your joining us. I want to thank my Department of Comparative Cultural Studies for co-sponsoring this event, and of course, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the program here at University of Houston. And a big shout out to Dr. Aishwarya Lakshmi for her support as director of that program to make sure that this event could happen and we could all be together this evening. I know many of you, but I am now Associate Professor of Comparative Cultural Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies here at University of Houston, where I've been for some time on this journey with this book. And I've also received over the years much support from the Friends of Women's Studies that make sure that we have this outstanding gender studies program. I came to Houston from the Department of American Culture at University of Michigan and got my degree in American Studies and then made my way into gender studies. It's really shaped me as a scholar and this project. And so I'm looking forward to talking about what it means to bring all of these kinds of intersections together. There are so many people here that, you know, I would love to thank that I don't always get to see. Thanks for keeping your cameras on so I can see your beautiful faces if you're comfortable with that. I'm gonna wave Roberto and Chuck. I see Evelyn. I see Ayana and Zahir. Delighted to see you. I see Natalie in DR. Beverly, Alora, Raul, Elizabeth Manley, so many more people, but I appreciate your indulging me on that because it's really a community event. Hi, Viviana. Hi, Diana. Hi, Robin, and thanks for being here. And hi, Brian from North Carolina, Barry from San Francisco. Wow, what a treat. So hi, Chingin, and hi, Sharon. Wow. So I'm excited to share what I have been spending this major chapter of my life working on, and I welcome your thoughts. So LeConté Dill and I have known each other since graduate school. We met at the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival at Ithaca College as graduate students, and our curiosity for visual culture, I guess. And since then, it has been a pleasure to sort of move through academia parallel to LeConté and see the ways that she has moved as a scholar. I wanted LeConté to just read a little from your beautiful bio on your page because it captures like how you position yourself is something that I'm learning. Dr. LeConté Dill was born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, California, the granddaughter of sojourners of the second wave of the Great Migration. She remains curious about sojourning, migrations, and landing and launching places and spaces. LeConté literally means fairy tale. And likewise, LeConté listens to, documents, dreams, and creates stories of reimagining. She is a scholar, educator, and a poet in and out of classroom and community spaces. Of course, she also earned her BA in sociology from Spelman College and a Master of Public Health and Community Health Sciences with a focus in child and family health from the University of California, Los Angeles. And she grew skills and partnerships working in the nonprofit and public sector. And those are some of the reasons why I wanted to get to have my first book launch event in conversation with her. You can see the kind of background that she brings to thinking about the experiences of women of color. And I'm teaching again this semester my course on Black girlhood, a topic that I've learned about from scholars like LeConté and others in the room this evening. And so I hope we can, have a fun time. I'm getting just past my little nerves as I warm up, but LeConté and I have also been in conversation at the National Women's Studies Association, which has been a space that's really mentored me and shaped my scholarship. And we've had the opportunity to talk about Black and South Asian solidarities in that space and mentorship we've received. And also, I think about this book event as an opportunity, like inviting the opportunity to get to be in conversation with scholars like LeConté. So I wanted to get that on the table.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm and generous introduction of yourself and of me and of our friendship and camaraderie. So I'm going to just do a brief description of the text and how I experienced the text. And you talked about your nerves, I think a bit healthy nerves of excitement of engaging with your own work with a broader audience. I had my own nerves in facilitating this conversation because I wanted to do right by you. I wanted to do you justice and your work justice as your friend, as your comrade. But after I kind of got over the nerves, because we're sister scholars and we were going to do right by each other, I really got into the text, and I feel that being La Dominicana really is Dr. Quinn's commitment and documentation and love of transnational Black feminisms embodied in art. She situates herself in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and with Dominican women, and really engages, as you heard, she's a transdisciplinary scholar, and really engages the various disciplines that she's learned and studied and come to know and come to interrogate and disrupt, really focusing on visual culture, from dolls and gift shops in the capital city, to music videos, to theater, to poetry, to the everyday of Black women, Black Dominican women and mixed race Dominican women seeing themselves, how they're portrayed, but also how they see themselves and define themselves. As I read the text, I really was really engaging between her narration and the notes pages. And like a good scholar, right? Found myself like doing my own homework and looking things up and putting a pin in things and wanting to ask questions. And so I'm really excited that I get to ask those questions directly with the author, with Dr. Quinn. And this evening, even in the Zoom space, is meant to be, rigorous and fun. I think that fun and play is rigorous as well as scholarship is rigorous. So, I see y'all already putting love in the chat. Continue to do that. Use your emojis, finger snaps. If we're looking at your camera, think about, creating a space of love in this space as we dig into the text.
Okay. So one thing already, LeConté, that you have we started to talk about was the multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and I have identified myself as an interdisciplinary scholar because of the field that I come from and the way that we talk about that. But you, in this conversation that the book has brought about, you already invited me into some other tools for thinking about, what it means to take these different disciplines to understand context. And I haven't yet decided if I'm like on team transdisciplinary, but I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how you've used that in your own research.
Sure, great question. I've been using that phrase since like my first day as a doctoral student. I went to UC Berkeley, go Bears, if anyone's in the room. And my program in public health was rhetorically transdisciplinary, like in all the marketing on the website and when we applied in orientation day, they talked about being transdisciplinary and translational. And some alumni and faculty have even written about and published about what that means for them. But what I experienced and what I've experienced as a student, but even now just as a scholar in the academy and in the community, is that the notion of transdisciplinary is different than multidisciplinary and different than interdisciplinary, and that it's not just taking a couple of different disciplines, like maybe taking a class here or reading over here or publishing over here, but it's really trying to transform and reimagine and create anew. Recently, this summer, in conversations with other transdisciplinary scholars, I've begun kind of adopting maybe undisciplinary and undisciplined, because many of us, like radical critical scholars, want to, I went to school, I went to Spelman, I went to school in Atlanta, so we want to throw them bows, right? We want to like break out of our disciplines, even though sometimes we find a home, oftentimes we do not find a home. And so I identify as a disruptor oftentimes in the fields that I was trained in. And so transdisciplinary kind of gave me that permission and gave me that language to create anew. But I'm also currently trying on undisciplinary. I think Rachel and I, we've talked a lot about language, and I think, ask us in a year and we might be coming up with some new terms, or maybe also language, an English language might not do it justice, right? So we might be using other forms of art, of sound to describe how we come to this work.
Yeah, I appreciate that because, it was a very challenging process to create this first book. And I think some of that was trying to bring together all of the different disciplines and the ways that I've been taught to see and the ways that I know to see, which has included for me like theorizing across Black women's writing and literature and bringing that into an analysis of visual culture. I wanted to just get us started with an image and just reading right from the text. So let me see if the technology will do what I want. I wanted to read just a couple paragraphs from the beginning of the first chapter. And this is my first time reading from my published book. And so I wanted you to have the experience of how I was doing close readings. So this chapter is called Sites of Identity, Facebook, Murals, and Vernacular Images. When a snapshot of two Dominican women appears in my Facebook feed, I glance at it in passing, but something about it sticks with me and I return to look again at the image. Penelope's photograph is a deliberate critique of the medium. It's an image squared by Instagram's stylistic format, but she has posted it simultaneously onto her Facebook page. Two young brown-skinned women in the Caribbean standing side by side outdoors in late afternoon light. Penelope, standing on the right, is dressed in a shining black Doc Martens boots, a white t-shirt and hoodie, and torn jeans reminiscent of the 1980s. Her short hair, recently dyed green, is a shock. She points her left index finger at her friend standing close beside her, while at the same time she curls her tongue a la Miley Cyrus circa 2014 and strikes a pose for the camera. Her friend Alida Reyes purses her lips, chin tilted up at the photographer. You can almost hear the sound of disapproval that might accompany this expression. Alida is wearing a baseball cap, a Wu-Tang Clan t-shirt cut to a high midriff, and high-waisted shorts, the fashion of the moment, hitched up with a narrow belt. Her feet are clad in the type of thin faux leather sandals in metallic colors that are common across the island. As a visual artist, Penelope Collado has used social media to share many images from her daily life because of her self-conscious awareness of the ways that images signify. The photographs Penelope shares are often act as what Deborah Willis refers to as frozen racial metaphors. Penelope posted this photograph online with the text "Con la Ibera" and hashtag Santo Domingo Paradise. Her comment makes cynical reference to things being not quite as one expects them to be in the Caribbean, and sarcastically names her friend Ibera, which in Dominican terms would imply that she's rural, uncivilized, and perhaps uncouth. Penelope's hashtag in English serves as a sardonic reference to the ways that the reality of Santo Domingo does not conform to foreign viewers' imagined paradise of the Caribbean. Rather, if you take another look at the photograph, you see that the two young women are standing in front of 4 or 5 oil barrel trash cans overflowing with garbage, a far more common sight in the island than a pristine beach. Comments written in colloquial English and Dominican Spanish below the photo range from shocked to supportive, encouraging to teasing, capturing the ways that community response is a part of posting curated images online. Penelope, who has much experience modeling her thin, racially mixed Dominican body in professional photos, is well aware her short green hair and the garbage in the background disrupt the dominant narrative of an exotic and appealing Caribbean. The image she has produced documents an alternate reality of Santo Domingo and provides a critique by way of a counter image that demonstrates to viewers her awareness of the popular Caribbean visual discourse in which she is embedded. So I offer that as an example of the ways that I am reading this archive that is social media. And I'm just going to show one more image without a reading, if I can. Maybe I can't. It's not that one. Well, never mind. Oh, there it is. I just wanted to share like the selfie that Cindy Galan allowed me to use in my book, but just like the ubiquity of the selfie as part of studying culture and society. And I was really pleased to be able to include that with the text as we think about who Dominican women are in the context of Santo Domingo at the moment that I was writing about. They're very much engaged with visual culture as we are in so many places, but it's often the case that we don't use tools we have to talk about the visual and analyze the visual. So I tried to do that throughout this text.
Thank you for that close reading. I know some people also are showing appreciation in the text. I know often with book talks, we often jump right into describing the text and jumping into Q&A, and we don't often get the opportunity to hear the author voice their own words out loud and the ways that they engage with their own reading analytically, but also sonically. So thank you for that. And thank you for also showing the images. For those of you that don't have the text but are anticipating it, there's several images throughout the text. I mean, Dr. Quinn also engaging with visual art is literally doing that in the text. And she might talk about in the Q&A, the logistics between doing that as a scholar, but negotiating with press and with interlocutors. But I know there's going to be another version, I think maybe, I don't know if an electronic version or another version of the text that will actually have, so in the current version, there's black and white images, but there's going to be a version that might have the colored version of the images, which evokes another type of reading. So thank you for that. So let's jump into it. You begin and continue throughout the text, really talking about your own positionality And beyond being an ethnographer, you really engage with autoethnography, and you talk about how your own positionality brought you to the island, brought you to the Dominican Republic as a research site. So if you could share more for the audience about how you began to build authentic community in Santo Domingo. I know you spent some time living there through like one chunk of time when you were a doctoral student, and then you've gone back several times professionally and socially. So how did you do that? How do you negotiate that? How did you build with people and then come to know your interlocutors?
Well, some of the folks are here, and I'm hoping they will offer comments when we get to Q&A as well. But you know, as a graduate student, I was interested in this question of mixed race, my own experience in moving across borders and how I was seen and contextualized. And so when it came to thinking about like thinking through critical race theory more broadly and thinking about racial mixture, I wanted to learn from places outside of the US. I think we're like barely getting into a conversation around mixed race, particularly Black and white mixed race. And so I thought looking at other parts of the world where it's very mixed would be helpful to my understanding. And I did not look at Brazil, but I was reading a lot of the literature of Brazil, but I had some background in speaking Spanish. So it was actually Percy Hinson at Berkeley, I think, who said, oh, you know, like, think about the Dominican Republic, where there aren't a lot of US scholars writing about this place. But, you know, in graduate school, having the opportunity to connect with Lord Gio Garcia Pena, I think we first met on a trip in the Dominican Republic that I took before I went to graduate school, where I hoped to kind of see if in that context I might be able to learn from other women about their experiences of mixed race. And I spent time I went in 2006, so 2008, and then I lived there for over a year in 2010 into 11, and then had been going back and forth up until the pandemic times, I think. And I was living with a writer, Erica Martinez, who's a Dominican writer. I found a language school looking for a community connection, and they placed me with a host family. I had studied Spanish throughout my education, but it had been a little while since I was immersed in it. And so I had the opportunity to live with a really wonderful family in a neighborhood, Los Sardines del Norte, outside of the capital. And so that was, you know, what scholars do, I think typically anthropologists do, to locate themselves and kind of get a sense of culture and community. But I was still, you know, questioning that, and I was gaining an understanding of transnational feminist theory and the reasons why we maybe don't approach, you know, a community that's not our own to write about. And so I actually ended up building friendships and relationships around my curiosity of this category of woman, also something that I was trying to explode, and looking to feminist scholars in the Dominican Republic who were already building transnational networks of like, was there a place for me in relationship to them? And so for my dissertation, I wrote about a group, an activist group, Tres Gatas, and that I was able to publish an article about their activist work, which has been funded by US funders. The group doesn't exist now, but the artists and those engaged appear in my book. Yaneris Gonzalez Gomez, Isabel Spencer. These folks are informed by feminist theory that actually, you know, was already immediately transnational, and many of them were reading in English Black feminist theorists that they were accessing through Estrella Foundation and other orgs. So they were already like going to the Dominican Republic was sort of, for me, starting to see what are the existing transnational ties that and where I might fit. And so the process of writing the book was trying to kind of illuminate the ways that there's already this constant flow, and that, you know, I made many friends through the process. And some of them I've stayed connected with, and some I, have not. So I for me, that was a normal process in relationship to like being a transnational subject, because I'm also a Ghanaian American. I have family, all over the globe. And so I think that was something that we could connect around, that and feminist activism that's happening transnationally. So
thank you for that. We hadn't talked about this, but I also know Erica. I met her decades ago through creative writing spaces. I know there's some Lona fam in the Zoom space, Voices of Our Nation Arts Foundation. And so it's just awesome how like these different intersections and friendships interweave.
And it highlights the artists, right? I mean, that this work and these communities are like, and that's why there's art and performance in, because the activists are engaging in art. And that's what I was being drawn to as well. So, and that's, very much who I want to be in conversation with. I didn't say that, LeConté, with you, but one of the other reasons why I want to be in conversation with you is because I see you as an artist, activist, and scholar.
Awesome. Thank you for seeing me as I see myself. So you talked a little bit about your different times in country. Of course, this major bulk of time when you were dissertating, and then have gone back again. But in the book, you intentionally go in 2016 for another round of data collection. And so I'm just interested or curious about, were you seeking to fill any gaps with that trip, answer new questions? And how did this later lens impact, because by then you had already, published, you had defended your dissertation, were in the academy as a faculty member, you've been publishing and doing other types of art making. And so how did this other trip impact your revising and writing of the book?
That's an interesting question that you asked, because I think it's, I had to come to terms with the change over time and like growing older, and my experiences of like growing up in certain ways as an activist and a scholar in the Dominican Republic, and then watching change over time and feeling very distant from the place. But what it also, trying to go back and forth and maintain connections and friendships, which reminded me very much of what my folks I was becoming friends with were experiencing as they moved in and out of Santo Domingo. And so going back to do additional research, that point is marked when, as a scholar, I get funding in order to make those trips, but I was sustaining connections via Facebook, WhatsApp, as we do when we're part of transnational communities. More specifically, I'd had opportunities to go and see some of the cultural productions and see like Isabel Spencer's La Casa de Bernarda Alba, as it was part of the theater festival in Santo Domingo. And then I had some time looking at how that emerged on Facebook, what the images were being archived there by Fran Afonso, was recording them. And so from afar, I could see some of that going on. And then I could go back and sit down with Isabel and fill in some gaps. So there is always this transnational back and forth. Yeah, and I mean, there were new people. Like then I was like, okay, let me spend some time talking to some of the actors in the performance, and see, and those were new relationships with different things that we might connect around. That was more on my having already engaged and been in the Dominican Republic for a while and was familiar with the context, so going to those interviews felt quite different than kind of immersing myself and hanging out with activists in Central Plazas during like 2010.
I know often when folks talk about art, even when we talk about art, visual art is often categorized separately from performing art. But throughout your work and probably your experience as an artist, you analyze the visual. So photography, like you've shown us, also murals throughout the country. or the city of Santo Domingo, but also the visual elements of quote unquote performing arts. So you talked about theater, the play, but also music and music videos and poetry. So can you talk a bit more about your choices and your approaches around what you call visual cultural analysis?
Yeah, I can. So I struggled to see them as separate, like the example that I gave you of how the theater performances were happening, but in real time they were being also represented, online, and how we use digital technology, I think is very important to constructing a Dominican identity, and then also, having this much broader audience. So I see them all in conversation with one another. I would say, and the ways that I have changed, thank you for these comments in the chat about what's resonating for you, because I not only grew up in ways and go back to the DR and have different interests and different, relationships I'm engaged in, but also in the context of Houston, I have been really shaped by my regular visits to the Menil and their collection of surrealist art, and sort of, at first having some hesitancy and frustration around surrealism. And then over time starting, and learning even from my colleague Sandra Zalman about surrealism and how I might think about it. And then going on these return visits to the Dominican Republic and seeing the ways that surrealist art is, I would argue, alive and well, right? And so also asking what the gaps are. So I had the opportunity to then, go look at Robin Kelly's writing on Black surrealists, right? And learning from Ayanna McLeod, for example, and artists locally in Houston that have shaped how I think about race and cultural production in this very global and transnational space, then helped me to then go back into the Santo Domingo context and maybe ask some parallel questions as I'm trying to solve these, bigger questions about mixed race identity and racial ambiguity that were always there for my study, but how do they emerge in murals, or how do they emerge in this online medium as it circulates really broadly? How do we read them? What I was able to see, and what I argue, it's I'm carrying my own narrative about what they are, but then having lived in the context of the Dominican Republic, it starts to inform what I'm seeing, and it taught me a lot about what the folks I connected with in the DR were seeing when they were looking at race and for race, which was something different than what I started seeing initially. Started out seeing. That makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So speaking of how the women are seeing race, but also color, you do a really important exercise in your research, but then also throughout the text of photo elicitation. So in your conversations with your interlocutors, you have kind of a sheet of photographs of Dominican women celebrities. And you show them in order to spark this dialogue about race, about color, about also gender expression and sexuality. And so there's 4 women that you have in this exercise: Martha Heredia, Rita Indiana, Zoe Saldana, and Michelle Rodriguez. And so if you can kind of briefly maybe orient the audience about who these celebrities are, but also the conversations that were coming up with your interlocutors. But my question, I was just really curious, you were doing this exercise, particularly in your first round of data collection, but if you would go back now, are there newer Dominican women celebrities that have kind of cropped up in popular culture and in the, in spaces that you might add to your photo elicitation? So I was thinking of Cardi or Amara La Negra, but although they are Dominican, do they have the same resonance? I know you were really interested in what's resonating in Santo Domingo. So if you could just talk about that exercise a bit.
Yeah. Yes. So, I created that list while in Santo Domingo. I think starting in 2006, and in conversation with my host family that I connected with, like who is popular. And so I was learning about Marta Heredia, who won Latin American Idol at the time in 2009, right before. So I guess she was added, and I came to the Santo Domingo with like just the name Rita Indiana, that I needed to pay attention to her work. And so I had, in contrast, I started to see the ways that race and color was always being constructed and produced relationally. And so I was experimenting with the tools of visual anthropology to see what it would look like to give people images to then talk about. Because what I knew very early on is that what I was seeing was different from what they were seeing, and the vocabulary that they were using to describe what they were seeing, you know, in terms of a color hierarchy, looked different than my own. So I found through visual anthropology and that approach, I found like showing these images that, sorry, I didn't bring a copy today. I'll have to dig up kind of what I printed out on a color printer and shared during the interviews, but showing Marta Heredia, for example, she drew like a lot of class analysis that shaped how people saw her color. And Rita Indiana is a fair-skinned Dominican, but because of her cultural performance and her music and her sound, it really racialized her, and it was someone that folks really knew and identified as Dominicana, like authentically so, right? And then with Zoe Saldana, I had started writing about her, and I have a piece, I'll try to drop a link to it, that was foundational to my thinking about, you know, how a mixed race body might become a screen onto which racial meaning gets projected, and why that functions the way it does. And so I included her, although I don't think she was as popular, but her work kept emerging. And then she wasn't as popular to Dominican audiences as she was, I think, in the diaspora. So on the ground. And then additionally, Michelle Rodriguez, like folks, you can see in my book, people don't necessarily immediately recognize her, but yet they've consumed like the Fast and Furious franchise, like all of it. Mostly, I think, yeah. So they kind of were like, oh yeah, that person. But yet we understand Michelle Rodriguez as very, in the diaspora, or I understood her as particularly Dominican. And then I thought it was very fitting that she ends up being cast as Minerva Mirabal. So I write about that, like what does her body do in that context? So I think in response to your question, LeConté, I don't have my finger on the pulse. I understand like the shift over time, and that young people in Santo Domingo are, enjoying other figures, popular figures. The landscape looks really different. Like, I think who those cultural producers and consumers are has started to shift quite a bit. I think like natural hair is, not a big controversy on the ground in Santo Domingo as it was before. I think, and I think, in some ways, as an outsider to the popular culture, like I was never like kind of the cool kid. Like I wasn't going to that much concerts as a young person in my 20s. So I was really curious about what folks were engaging with and how that helped them to shape their identities, or what resonated for them in Santo Domingo. And a lot of what they were consuming was beyond Santo Domingo. So while I was, fixated on these Dominican stars, they were maybe paying close attention to something well in the diaspora, right? Something edgier or different, and sharing that from Europe even. So I'm not up on Amara La Negra, and I'm not so much, Cardi B appears in here, but I would definitely refer you to Amari Zamora, and I'm excited about her work on Cardi B especially, and there's some other folks coming with that.
Thank you for engaging that fun question. I want to just remind folks to put questions in the chat function, because Q&A is going to come up really soon. And I think we're going to flip the engagement right now. And Rachel, you wanted to ask me some questions.
Well, okay, so the thing that I have been impressed by your work and the ways that you're so presently thinking about healing and Black girls, right? And like the realities of violence that Black women and girls are faced with. And with this project, you know, I felt like I danced around the subject quite a bit until the last chapter, where I just, you know, head on, I use a surrealist analysis of thinking about rage. I use, you know, I draw on what I'm able to take from feminist theory to think about this rage that I really feel around the violence that women and girls are experiencing in the Dominican Republic and LGBTQ plus folks. So my question to you, my broader question is this text useful to you? But I am really curious what you think of, like, you know, how do we move forward in doing work on this kind, like these levels of violence that we're always encountering when we choose to study Black women and girls? So it's like a broad question.
Really good question. Rachel's referring to her text in chapter 6. The title is Feminist Rage in the Right to Life for Women in the Dominican Republic. And so in this chapter, she very saliently talks about femicide in the DR and most, like, you know, across the globe, women, young women, girls and women who are murdered by the state, by vigilantes, by acquaintances and family members, often are erased and forgotten. And so Rachel highlights a couple of stories, amplifies those names, say her name, right? And then also the iconic, the visual, the pictures from protests, from marches. And so that very resonates with the work I've been doing for a number of years, particularly with Black girls, around quote unquote violence. So from a public health perspective, working with programs that are working on violence prevention, but oftentimes funders and evaluators erasing the fact that violence does happen, not just among, but experienced by girls. And that violence is only happening to boys, particularly when we're thinking about boys and men of color. And so a lot of my work, particularly early on, like when I moved to Brooklyn 8 years ago, was around the same time that Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and African American Policy Forum was doing the Why We Can't Wait, and then transitioned to Say Her Name campaigns, because there was an erasure. I literally was interacting with funders and journalists and researchers that, like, we're not even seeing the girls that were in the same school that they were visiting to do their photo shoot or do their story or do their profile. And that we're asking questions about violence, but missing all the other types of violence that are particularly experienced by Black girls and women. From epistemic violence to relationship violence, let alone violence in neighborhoods. So your work, particularly in chapter 6, definitely resonated from a transnational perspective, but also another resonance is the way that art is used by people in community, by people experiencing the violence, but also by people protesting and in activist spaces. Art is used to make sense of the violence that's going on, but also used as protest. And so I know I've learned from Black girls transnationally, their use of poetry, their use of song, their use of dance, their use of the selfie in so many ways around self-determination. So I'm excited in my current position at Michigan State University in the Department of African American and African Studies. I'm in a college, the College of Arts and Letters, and many of my colleagues identify as artist scholars or scholar artists. And so I in my bio, you know, I'm usually like scholar, comma, poet, comma, educator, but now I'm thinking more of a hyphen, the hyphen space. So scholar artist, and your work, even before your book, has helped me kind of unpack and articulate, like, what does it mean to live in the world as a scholar artist and to work in the academy as a scholar artist, artist scholar. And I think throughout the text, you help kind of provide a guidepost for that, but particularly in chapter 6, in the ways that you interact with the lives, the livelihoods, and the afterlives of the women and girls. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, so should we start engaging with our Zoom family? So I'm just gonna take a peek at the chat. I just see lots of kudos, which is, so, you know, comments, kudos, and or questions are fine, but we do want to just hold some space for folks that are tuning in that might have questions for Dr. Quinn, for her work, for some of the themes that percolated in this conversation tonight.
And I can read another passage if that helps people have a moment.
Sure.
You see some questions coming in, but I did want to share kind of like, so you get a sense of some of the ethnographic work as well. And this is in chapter 1 as well, where I'm talking with Paloma. She's, I say, I meet with Paloma in a corner of the library at La UAS on the 3rd floor. That's a public university. She finds time to talk with me in between classes in journalism and social communications. She has been in the United States, she tells me. Like many students in Santo Domingo, she has studied English. And when she was 18 years old, she went abroad through a summer work program to improve on her language skills. She paid a US company to travel to a small town in Georgia, in rural Georgia, for 4 months, where she earned minimum wage while working at McDonald's. After that, Paloma spent 3 months in New York City visiting relatives on a tourist visa, and then traveled to Puerto Rico and Colombia. She carries to our interview at the library a beat-up laptop that does not pick up Wi-Fi or have a working battery. When I ask her what she uses the internet for, she says mostly for reading the news, for Facebook, and to communicate with family abroad. Paloma is brown in color, morena, and growing out her own tight curls into a natural hairstyle. At the time of our meeting, I do not read her as particularly femme in her gender presentation, dress, or mannerisms. In contrast to the many other women on campus, she is taller and heavier, not dressed to conform to a particular aesthetic. Over time, our friendship deepens, and I see her in old pictures on Facebook in which her hair is in fact straight, or out at parties where she's wearing bright red lipstick, with which she claims a particular type of femininity. When I ask her about existing stereotypes about Dominican women, Paloma has little difficulty naming numerous characteristics with which she is familiar, ones I had by then heard many times. She says, I've always thought that the stereotype of the Dominican woman is that she's very sensual, that she's very extroverted, that she's very affectionate, that she works hard, but that she's also conservative in many things. Paloma continues her list, that she has to have a big butt, that she has to know how to dance, that she likes to party, that all Dominicanas know how to dance, that all Dominicanas know how to cook, that all Dominicanas have an ass, that all of us are hot, that we are very comparona, or we like to show off. And so I'm analyzing this discourse, and I say traditional discourses around acceptable ways of representing Dominicanness are so pervasive that for the women I interviewed, the social identity exists as a kind of common sense, a reservoir of knowledge that young women readily draw on as they envisage the Dominican woman trope, right, in quotation marks, and her associated stereotypes. Their experiences of race and gender soon became part of my own quote unquote common sense, as I hear variations on the same theme from many different interviewees. So I wanted to just offer that. So that is happening alongside my visual culture analysis in the context. And now I see many questions.
There are many questions popping up in the chat. This is going to be a good conversation, or continuing an already good conversation. So in thinking, kind of based on your last reading, I think this might be a great popping off or jumping off start part. How did your interlocutors in the Dominican Republic challenge or change your perceptions of Blackness in general, and then also Blackness in the US?
So that is the big question. And, you know, the theory that I develop in the book is how much it is relational, but, you know, and just that and socially constructed. So when we talk about Blackness from a US vantage point, it's loaded with an entire history and narrative that we need to be able to name. Like I'm trying to, you know, in my teaching, like be really specific. If we're talking about anti-Blackness, are we talking about anti-African Americanness, you know, and the ways that it's possible to be, you know, of the African diaspora, right? We internalize anti-Blackness, but there's these intersections of class and gender even, right? Like that we're trying to name, and that we often don't name those things. So for me, doing my research in the Dominican Republic did allow me to see many more nuances to constructions of Blackness. Specifically, in this book, I thought that I would be talking with more women who identify as Afro-Dominican or who I visually identified as Afro-Dominican, but what I emerged with is a text where I end up having some conversations with women who identify as Afro-Caribeñas, but and claim Blackness, and I would have read them differently. But I don't then say like, this is who they are. I just share my observations and how those observations help me to see, you know, the ways that I was socialized to understand race, and that there's something different going on in that context. And so I look to, you know, I mean, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, the book allows me to then be in further conversation with a lot of different people, particularly Black women who I'm interested in being in conversation with. And I think, you know, I'm seeing like Dominicans in diaspora have a different idea, I think, than some of what's happening on the ground. So this is an ongoing conversation around Blackness and race, and we're not there yet. We've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I think throughout the text you provide just so much nuance for that ongoing conversation. And I know that, like, even in one of the readings that you shared, one of your interlocutors was saying, well, she's Dominicana, and then there's another person that talks about, well, she's Black, and that like repetition of race and or ethnicity is really intriguing to like reify just connection or identity. Lots of good questions coming in the chat. One is, I'm really curious about this too. What was the most exhilarating and or terrifying part of your project?
I'm thinking really hard. You know, like, I mean, because I learned a lot about myself, and I kind of like who I am in these kinds of spaces. And honestly, I am an introvert who's really learned how to be an extrovert, and that has been, it's still a journey. That's why I'm like so excited to be here and so nervous. But for me, one of the things that has been really special to me are these experiences at like concerts in Santo Domingo, and like music and spaces that I maybe had not, like as a college student, been going out to so many concerts. And so I really enjoyed that. And I got to, you know, have and continue to go back to be either like getting to see Rita and Indiana in concert, also Xiomara Fortuna, and so many other different Dominican artists. And I find that exhilarating. There's other things that are terrifying that are harder to talk about. So.
There's actually someone who wants to ask a question live. So Dr. DeGenova, I hope I said your name correctly. If you can unmute yourself, there you are.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Dill, and thank you, Rachel. I've been really interested in many of the points you're raising, Rachel, and wanted to sort of ask you, you know, jumping off from your discussion of surrealism, if there were ways in which you kind of witnessed a kind of everyday surrealism where in ordinary discourse, in everyday life, where people, in a sense, play with and scramble and invert, conventional common sense ideas about race and gender. I mean, it's something that I've thought about in my work as well, that the absurdity of race almost, sort of requires a certain kind of surrealism to unsettle these kind of ossified, fixed, reified, sort of notions about what race means. And I imagine that the same thing would be true for gender in your work.
Thank you for that. So I mean, I think that is one of the reasons why theater then became that space, because I could see, especially with the work and the collective projects that Isabel Spencer has been engaged in, both in Santo Domingo, also in Mexico City, working with other performers. This heightened awareness of how we perform gender what emerged there. And with that, these ideas about race and color. And what I read for is in a version of La Casa de Bernarda Alba, these layers of meaning because of the different colors, skin colors, or of the actresses in the piece. And, and the reason I ended up thinking more in terms of surrealism was because of Federico Garcia Lorca as the queer author of that text and how they were engaging with that text. But it's the work itself then leads me to this kind of what do we do with Afro surrealism? And in that moment, it's like the ambiguities. That's what I'm trying to get at. I don't feel as a new scholar, I don't feel like with a first book that I have a full handle on what surrealism has to offer me. I just feel like we should be paying closer attention to it, particularly in a context, that of the Dominican Republic that had 3 decades of a dictatorship, and all of these artists, kind of responding to that experience and this intimacy with death, as well as the folks coming from a Franco-fascist era to the island, right? So there's layers of trauma there, and I don't really I'm not investigating trauma in my project, but I am, as you're saying, LeConté, it's how is art being used to respond to this present reality that is so laden with violence that I think in 2010, it felt different for Dominicans and for folks in the US. And now this decade later, the intimacy with death, which I see as a part of what surrealism can help us to think about, is another way that we might intervene. But of course, a lot of the Afro surrealists work is not get recognized and mentioned. So hopefully this book encourages people to look more to that and build on that.
I think you definitely amplify Afro surrealists. As someone who wasn't as engaged in surrealism, your work helped me realize about, and then I went down the rabbit hole of learning about Afro surrealists, and then also remembering, I'm oh, is some of my own work Afro surrealist, and definitely learning from your work as Afro surrealist. So I really appreciate the teaching that you're doing in your work, in addition to the analysis. So I know you talk a lot in the text, and you even mentioned in this Zoom space about your interlocutors, some who are in the Zoom space, but someone has a question about how you engage them in the publication. So post-publication, post-book, but I also know that you were engaging folks along the way as you were revising chapters and revising pieces. So if you can kind of talk about that.
Yeah, I can. I mean, we know it's a difficult thing, right? How our positionality and power within the academy in relationship to communities that we work with, the ways this already I tried to in the text show that this is a conversation, but I have sustained these different relationships, inviting folks those who speak English to come to this conversation with plans to have a conversation in my rusty Spanish in the future, and with the intention of, figuring out how soon I can have this text available in Spanish. And it's interesting because the translations are my own, and the interviews were some in English, some in Spanish. It switches back and forth, but I think that also speaks to the transnationalism and the ambiguity, and that there's always things that are lost in translation. I was able to, share with people digital files. Folks, I did a digital survey and initially, and was on campuses and trying to find young women 18 to 20 something that wanted to talk with me about this category of the Dominican woman and how they experienced it and how it shaped their sense of self in the world. And those that were interested in continuing, we built friendships and they've stayed in touch. I just was, hearing from folks where I become a resource, and that's something I like to do. It's here are links and opportunities for things that, that they can connect to, whether that's funding or classes. And, so I'm learning from them and they're learning from me. And I've tried to be as intentional as possible. And also sharing audio files, I'm become the keeper of the archive, just as you might have someone in your family that does that work. So
there's a question about the archive.
Yeah.
So if you can talk a little bit more about the idea of the archive, particularly the archive of the everyday, and how both the virtual and the analog work together or at odds in constructing Dominican mixed race identity. Great question.
Yeah, great question. Who's that question from?
Roberto Tejada.
Thank you, Roberto. Okay, so I saw this project as really saying we need to think about Facebook as an archive, right? And all of the different ways that activists have been using that space, and negotiating the tensions around feeling surveilled. But along with that, then, if I'm in conversation with historians, how capable are they of reading the layers of an image, or do they just leave that out, which is what I'm seeing. If you start to pick up books, I would have liked to have more images in here, but I was learning as, my first book, how does one negotiate having the image and what work it's able to do on the printed page versus having parallel spaces. So you have a digital archive that is constantly changing, can disappear at any time. And it's also based on relationships, right? So I would have access to Lorena Espinosa's photographs. Some are included in my book, but because I follow her on Facebook and I know her from on the ground, and so I can see, not just the public allowable images, but other things that she's archiving through Facebook. We're at a moment where people are pretty over Facebook, but what do we do with that kind of archive? And that's all, that work on Facebook was also in response to the kinds of archives that my historian peers like Elizabeth Manley out there, we're negotiating on the ground in Santo Domingo. I just made a few visits to the National Archive, and the kind of fight that it takes to get the resources that you want to be able to shape a story and represent, women's history. It's and there's a lot more gatekeepers. So the kind of archive that I worked with was a more public facing archive, and it wasn't, and the folks contributing to it weren't necessarily at the moment thinking about it as an intentional construction, but it has all of these traces, and especially including the body, the Dominican body, right? That's what we're doing with the selfies or with the poses of being on the beach and replicating and echoing images from an archive 100 years ago. I could say more, but thanks, Rebecca.
So folks, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, we're going to be rocking out for another 25 minutes or so. So definitely engaging with your questions, my questions, Rachel's questions for us. But also if folks have to leave, we also understand that. You spoke of Elizabeth Manley, and she would like to ask the question live.
Yes, mostly. So I can say congratulations and how excited I am about this book coming out and being just really thrilled, particularly. I mean, I have a lot of self-interest in work on Dominican women and Dominican womanhood and race and gender. That helps me. And so I'm selfishly happy, but I also feel like I have a lot to learn from you in the interdisciplinary way in which you've approached this, particularly as I go into my next project. And I wanted to go back to this first image you showed about that had the hashtag of Santo Domingo Paradise, because I think one of the, I think it's often sort of almost taken for granted, right, that, and not in a good way, that Dominican women or Caribbean women in general's bodies and mix these kind of racially ambiguous bodies get used, not just in this kind of look, it's pretty, but it is a stand-in for the nation, and the nation we're trying to sell through tourism, right? And I loved the way that that image pushes back against that in subtle, sometimes subtle, but sometimes not so subtle, like that is literally trash, right? And I was wondering if you could talk more about how that is happening in the different places that you're seeing, right? Whether it's with Isabel Spencer's work or through Rita's work or other visual mediums in which we may be able to see some resistance to the use of women's bodies to sell the nation, sell out. I mean, in some of the ways that tourism is talked about, even kind of sold out. If you had more examples, I would love to hear more about that.
I appreciate that. I feel like I don't really, use that, like the idea of the nation as an entry point. Like it was one of the entry points of going and studying the Dominican Republic and the ways when people talk about their identity as Dominican. But then I end up kind of looking more at how a neoliberal moment in capitalism is shaping, these values. And so I guess, that brings up kind of, in some of your work, it's like the folks constructing the archive then become they are the elite women invested in, constructing this national identity. Whereas in my work, I was interested in talking with young women that like more working class, but they were still in college typically, because I was seeking their own critiques. But I didn't feel like national identity was coming up in the same way that the previous generation might. And that perhaps is because of the ways that they're thinking about mobility. And, often what I saw was like they were trying to think of ways to get away from the island, which can feel very small. But then over the span of this time of working on this project, many have been returning or trying to get away from like places like the US that, we're not have as much to offer them as, a previous moment. And so the constructions of self as Dominican often emerged like when, I think Patricia, like going to Germany, right? And then being otherized in that context. But maybe not necessarily because of where she sort of falls in this color hierarchy. It was not like Afro-Dominican identified, it was just somehow other. So, I mean, it emerges in other moments early on with like Facebook producing these spaces where people can claim Dominican identity and align with that and build community. But I think what I focused more on was how the threads take us everywhere, and that we can, like I was interested in challenging that national identity when folks I was interviewing were reading all these texts from the US, and we could find connections and parallels across our, feminist readings that were quite different from narratives of the national identity that maybe an earlier generation was getting more of. Do you think that answers, Beth, what you're thinking about? Can't wait to talk with you more about it. But
so there's a question about your interest in visual culture. You mentioned that you and I met at a film festival. back in 2009, I believe, when a group of scholars of color were invited or as fellows to the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. You're also a filmmaker and might also engage with other types of art. So the question is, did your interest in visual culture begin with this dissertation research project, or earlier in your academic career, or earlier in your life? Tell us more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the earlier in your life part has really got me thinking, like, where, what's the root? But, I always say, I will always say that I got my master's degree from California Newsreel, where I worked for 3 years in documentary film distribution and production in San Francisco. And that really shaped, I was just eager to consume, right? This is another theme in the text, is like, what does it mean to consume Blackness in across these different registers? I was eager to have a better understanding, having come up in a very white community, of Black histories and Black visual culture. And that was a space where I was learning critical race theory, but I was also like, getting to see, I'm thinking like Marlon Riggs and how his work shaped, how I think of what visual culture and film can do. And I continue to teach ethic notions all these decades later, and it's like changes minds. Like, so maybe that's definitely a root, but the reason I ended up at California Newsreel was looking up documentary film and African-American identity on the internet at that time, and finding that small project of where they're producing quality films. And then, my colleagues there are often like, don't make film because it's really challenging, as is writing. But Ruben Duran invited me as soon as I got to Houston to join on this project, Cimarron Spirit. And I had the opportunity to, learn about digital storytelling and shape how we told stories about Afro-Dominican identity. So, but early on I was a reader, and I was really hungry for literature that represented Black people and helped me to think about the construction of identity. So if that is a theme from high school and being exposed to Toni Morrison's work, and then, coming to ask these questions of Dominican women on the ground in Santo Domingo, it's like, what is informing you that shapes who you are and how you talk about who you are? And what happens when who you are is, malleable and ambiguous and can shift context to context, based on what you might need to mobilize or how you're being perceived.
You do a lot of important work in the book about gender expression, gender identity, and sexuality. There's a question, did you interview any Dominican trans women or trans men?
I didn't, and I mention it in the book. It's not that trans folks weren't there, they were not as present in 2010. That shifted with the like Pride parade and festivities. There was more activism amongst trans folks in La Romana, so I encountered activists, but then making these return visits, I saw more engagement and connection with trans folks, particularly Isabel Spencer's work in theater. And yeah, I have elsewhere I write with a critique of the kind of, how this globalized pride, spaces and what that looks like, although it's, also been valuable for communities, to connect, trans folks to connect with one another. But there's a real like neoliberal movement that makes people more visible. And then, my critique is it also makes people more vulnerable. And so, this is a very top-down view of what like LGBT activism might look like.
There's a question kind of going back to your photo dissertation. Hi, Francine. A question about Zoe Saldana. So you mentioned that in the DR, although she's Dominican, and she wasn't as popular, or at least in the like daily lexicon, as in the US. But Francine's question is about particularly Zoe's portrayal of Nina Simone and all the backlash or conversation that happened in the US, particularly for African Americans, and how it kind of distanced her from Hollywood here. So just wondering, like, what have been the conversations about Zoe in country?
Yeah, so I'm trying to kind of pull up this article that I did write about Zoe, and I tried to avoid that topic of the where she plays Nina Simone. I think like people in the context of the Dominican Republic, at the moment I was there, it was actually more like around Avatar, and they were proudly screening Avatar. So I write a little bit about that, and it's like a perfect example of how her body can be whatever we want it to be, right? That it's literally a screen being projected on. But she is able to, she's identified as trigueña, or, you know, which is like lighter in the hierarchy, although it's all context specific. So I would say if you put her image next to Marta Heredia, who's classed as like Dominican York and working class, that they're similar in color, but there's things about presentation and what people are reading on the body that position Zoe Saldana differently. And she does have one Dominican film as well. And if you look at that film, like you can see some of the humor around her color in it, like because her love interest is lighter skinned than her, right? So there's these expectations about her hypersexuality because of her brownness, but she's mostly been in more upper class spaces, celebrated and recognized by Dominican elite. And so, I mean, often people ask, like, has Zoe Saldana seen my article? You know, which I think is attention also when you're writing about stars, and there's like a, you know, this like star text, like, has Rita Indiana seen my writing about her, this chapter, right? Because I am offering these critiques, and I wasn't focused on like having a like having those stars as interlocutors. I was really reading them as texts, and what can their performances tell us, and those performances including like when they're being interviewed and how they're presented in the YouTube archive, for example, and what work I can do as a cultural studies scholar in reading that. So I look forward to talking with you more about it, Francine. Thanks. And there's the article in the chat.
Going back to chapter 6, when you particularly focus on violence against girls and women, there's a question about, do you feel that this violence is related to the violence against as disappearance of Indigenous women in America, in the US, or the Americas, I think, and is related to the devaluation of women as marginalized?
Mm-hmm. I do feel that way, but I don't offer that analysis in my text because it's sort of a conclusion of like thinking about Black and white mixedness and what happens when there's this ambiguity around, even if this young girl is a girl or a woman or a mother, a potential mother, right? But I mean, I do think, you know, another scholar ought to come and engage in analysis of like, you know, these legacies of colonialism that have to do with the relationship to like indigeneity. I mean, that's the other thing that emerges with Avatar. It's like a heavily consumed narrative of Pocahontas, right? And so to put Zoe in that is very interesting. And then to have these large screenings of that film in Santo Domingo, it's like there's much more work to be done on how we might think of indigeneity as a layer of the ways that women are treated in Santo Domingo.
There's a question for both of us, which I appreciate, about, though this person wants to hear more about academic friendship and the role that it's played for both of us journeying throughout academia as women of color, particularly in writing books. I told you that this book is actually an inspiration for me as I'm embarking on writing a book or books. And so if we can talk more about how we make community and build sisterhood.
It's a great question. My head is still spinning about like how many of my friends are right here with me, and it's really special. And like academia becomes something like of a space that we survive as women of color, and only because we have like these networks. I'm always like trying to hammer into my graduate students, like to build these feminist relationships and like see each other, right? This moment of like really seeing one another after coming up in a space where we're not seen or parts of us are not welcome. And so, like I said, I mean, I'm just getting a taste of what it feels like to have a book out in the world. And then people want to engage with your inner life around that. And so, but my regret would be that like my list of acknowledgements is not as long as I would like, because there's so many people in different moments of this like decade plus that sustained me, even if in immediate interaction, like in a moment, that make this possible. But particularly, I think, South Asian feminist, transnational feminist scholars, Black feminist scholars, and more recently, like it's been more recent in my journey where I've been able to make the kinds of meaningful academic relationships that I want to have. And so I'm hoping that the intellectual work can help deepen that, because I've always said like the reason I keep showing up in this space is because there's all these brilliant people, particularly women of color, that I get to be in conversation with, and that is the gift for me. So I mean, LeConté, how long we've been friends for a long time now.
Yeah, since 2009. And a lot of that, like, right through social media, right? It's not like we, I mean, we do talk on the phone and now Zoom and text, but not on a like weekly basis or anything. And so I think that, although social media is fraught in many ways, I think it has connected particularly my tribe of Black feminist scholar comrades, where at least you can like peek in and be like, how you doing? Or, then if you need to follow up in the DMs or like earlier, follow up and do some meditation together and hold space. You can do that in addition to like engaging around the scholarship. And I think for me, I intentionally relocated to Michigan because of the Black feminist space that we're growing here in the Department of African American and African Studies, that although I've had Black feminist comrades for all of my career, probably life, I didn't want to just wait till NWSA and meet up with folks, in the hallways or at dinner. And then I'm really blessed that I have colleagues on a daily basis who identify but also act as Black feminists in the world. But we're also doing work unapologetically around Black feminisms, genders, and sexualities. And so this was like an intentional move at this stage of my career and my life and for my family to physically relocate to cultivate that space. That before was again through like WhatsApp threads and text threads and meet up at this conference and maybe try to work on this special issue together, that kind of, and literally I'm grasping because it felt like let me hold on to that glimpse. And I know folks, especially in this Zoom space, are doing it in different ways inside and outside of academia, and despite academia, creating tribe and squad and collectives. And so I'm inspired by the ways that we're doing it. Yeah, the memes that we send one each other just to lift spirits, like the memes and gifts that I have one friend that like, that's how we talk. Like we're not necessarily talking using words. We send memes and gifts like daily.
Because memes
and so
capture so much.
Yeah, as an art form, right? And so that's a study as well.
But you're doing that transnationally as well. I mean, that's the thing. Like, yes, amongst our scholar networks are broad and global, and the communities. Like, I'm thinking of your connections to South Africa and your research in that space, right? And
yeah,
how we're able
and like you also said, like transnationally, how although there's amazing like in-country Black feminist work being done, how much Black feminists across the globe are reading US Black feminisms as sacred texts. And just seeing the intersections that I think we make anyway as trying to go authentically and like in right relationship to the country, but knowing like they're already doing that deep study too, and that those are the linkages. And so, yeah, like Johannesburg has a piece of my heart, and learn. So, and the thing about like South Africa, like speaking of deep study, like people will be like in the club or in a bar, like with books and backpacks, and not in a pretentious in the ways that we might do in the US of like, let me tell you how learned I am, like literally like dancing, drinking, and yeah, here's some Fanon, and yeah, here's some Angela Davis, and yeah, here's some poetry.
And I think that's what makes it possible then to find our people across these networks, right? I mean, and more recently, I've been trying to write a bit about Magali Pineda, an activist, late activist in the Dominican Republic who I admire. And, you know, she was then saying, what did that look like in the 70s? How are we transmitting these hard copy texts and shaping, right? But that's where we're finding these connections. And so I think, you know, I am often asked, as if I'm an anthropologist, like what, you know, how are you genuinely going into this space? But as a cultural studies scholar, I'm looking at the bridges that exist and how, you know, the conversations that we're in and who are the people that, you know, we're reading these same texts and we are developing values that have overlap. And like, it's an opportunity for me to learn from folks, and they want to learn from this scholar network as well.
We definitely have people showing you love in the chat.
Thanks,
folks are dropping off the Zoom, but we feel the love. In the last couple minutes that we have now, are there any final words, final thoughts that you have to share?
Hello, wonderful people. Hi, Ricky. Hi, Christy. See you. Hi, Andy.
Shout outs as a Black feminist praxis.
Cherie. That's amazing. Kimberly and Kelly King Jackson. I really appreciate you all being there. I see my sister, Susan. Yeah, shout outs as a feminist practice. Wow. We should do this more often.
Well, thank you all for your time. Thank you for holding space with us. I hope folks are getting or have or about to get or are gifting people, students, comrades, family, friends, being La Dominicana, as you continue to engage with the text on your own and in community. Thank you for this time. Thanks for joining us. Be well.
Look forward to talking with you about the book.